Thank you so much for coming and for your interest in this topic. I want to begin with a question. Do you think that the world is a better place than it used to be? Do you think it's getting better or worse? Interesting. Slavery is one of those things that, and there's going to be a Q&A time, and I'll be interested to hear why you think, but just a few quick ones. Why would you say it's getting worse? Just a few quick people.
More information.
We know more about the bad things. Okay, that's true.
We know more about all the bad things that are going on, and the good things don't get the publicity.
Okay, but is it actually getting better or worse? Worse. Actually getting worse. Interesting. Now, slavery is one of those things that we traditionally reassured ourselves about as a signpost for us getting better and society getting better and things gradually getting better. So we have this basic emancipation story. And of course, we've got these great emancipation stories in our scriptures, right? So you all know those, Moses and all of that. And I was raised Jewish originally. I'm a convert to Christianity, but I'm still a Jew as well. And certainly when we sat around the Passover table, we would say it's as though we ourselves came out of slavery. That's part of the Passover celebration. And so when we go forward into our own troubled history, and we have these basic dates that we reassure ourselves about: Emancipation Proclamation, 13th Amendment. You know, we're done with slavery in the 19th century. And it's not just us. You know, it's something worldwide. We have the movement in our mother country that ironically would have caused us to not have slavery as a divisive issue if we'd stayed part of England. They abolished slavery in the 1830s. You all know that, right? So there's a little irony of American history. Now, we do it for this Declaration of Independence about all men are created equal, but we got slavery 30 years longer than the mother country would have permitted. Okay, so we have a lot of ironies about that, but we feel like we've made some progress here. And then you've been sitting through these lectures about human trafficking, and I don't know if you've heard some of the statistics that are bandied about. 27 million is the common one. We don't really know. And the idea that this is a modern form of human slavery and that we're not done with this yet, right? That's what you all have been hearing about. Now, I'm going to talk about basically 4 different kinds of situations involving what we call human trafficking. Talk about the traditional sex and labor trafficking. Those are the first 2. Then I'm going to talk about the intersection of trafficking and adoption, which is kind of a troubling thing. And then I'm going to talk about commercial surrogacy, which is a form of assisted reproductive technology, and the intersection of that and the sale of human beings. But what this comes down to again and again is this notion that there are new forms by which we commodify, big fancy word for make into things or exploit or use to our ends to the detriment of the people being used. That there are new ways that human beings are vulnerable to exploitation in our particular time. And how do we meet those new challenges, and how does that compare to the 19th century challenges we had over slavery? What I'm going to suggest, whether things are getting better or worse, is that there are new challenges in every generation. We're only alive a short amount of time, and we got to be alert to meeting what are the threats to human dignity in our own time. Whether it's getting better or worse, that's up to God. I don't know how it's going to come out, but we have our own challenges to meet. When we talk about human trafficking, there's one fundamental distinction between it and the kind of slavery that existed in the 19th century, and that's legality. And that makes a big difference as to what we do about it. There was the idea that William Wilberforce could get a bill passed through the British Parliament in the 1830s, and they could, at the stroke of a pen, abolish. Abraham Lincoln could have his Emancipation Proclamation, but especially when you have the 13th Amendment, it gets passed, it gets ratified at the stroke of a pen, you could, quote, abolish slavery. And why could you do so? Because the kind of slavery we were dealing with was a creature of the law. So if you could change the law, it was gone. You all understand, right, what I'm doing. Now, we're not in that world anymore. Legislation can help, it can hurt, but it can't get us all the way there. Because by definition, most of the human trafficking that we're dealing with is really, and I don't mean to sound negative when I say this, a marketing of a series of discrete, different wrongs, serious wrongs, and a linkage to the past, but it's stuff that was already illegal before we called it trafficking. We've had a federal trafficking law since 2000 here in the US, Alabama less years than that, but those laws don't abolish trafficking. First of all, it was already illegal, the things they're calling trafficking, so we didn't need to abolish it. Secondly, because it was already illegal and was underground behavior, it's hidden. And even if there are 27 million people being exploited, you cannot abolish it with the stroke of a pen. And that brings a whole different set of challenges. You all understand that? Okay? It's hidden within other issues. So what are those other issues? I'm going to begin with the sex trafficking because that's the one that kind of gets the most press. Maybe I should end with it because by the time, something to wake you up again, but I will begin with the sex trafficking, okay, and that notion. What is that a repackaging of? First of all, sex trafficking is embedded in the prostitution, sex worker, prostituted woman or man or boy or girl issue. And obviously that didn't start in 2000. That's an old issue. Now, if you heard Tawan McCarthy, I've been on panels with her. I love her. She's great. What she's doing is great. You should support her. But she has a basic opinion, which is prostitution is trafficking. I don't know if that came through when she talked or not. That's not what the law says. And she knows that. We've had this conversation. I don't know if she talked about that. The law is dealing in a realm where prostitution is here and trafficking is over here. They're two different things. And they're affected by this debate about what do we do or should do about prostitution itself. Now, prostitution, of course, the selling and buying of sex. There are three different viewpoints internationally about what one should do about that. There's the kind of traditional, it's a low-level vice crime. You make the prostitute a criminal and you round them up, especially street prostitutes. The Johns, we don't quite know what to do with them, customers, because some of them are respectable citizens, but you do something with them. And basically, but it is vice crime even though it's illegal. And often we're zoning it, as long as it's not too visible, we're not going to eliminate it. It's just going to be there. It's an old profession, la-di-da-di-da. You've heard this all before. Then there's the legalization approach, Amsterdam, the idea that making it illegal, and some places in the US as well, that we ought to, in order to stop these sex workers, as they're sometimes called, from being exploited, we ought to raise their legal rights. That in a black market or gray market, illegal context, they're going to be more exploited. Whereas if we give them a union card, as they do in India, or parts of India, not all over, but say Calcutta, India, let them unionize, let them be able to have certain rights about how it's done, and try to keep the children out of it as part of the deal here. Make sure it's only adults, make sure it's nobody forced into it, and we can regulate it and we can clean it up if we legalize it in a way that we can't do if it's in the shadows. And that's the legalization Amsterdam model. Then we've got the Swedish Scandinavian model. And the model there says, look, we've looked over at Amsterdam, it's not that far from us, and we don't think you guys have really been that successful at making this a world in which nobody's exploited. We think that the sex worker is still, most of the time, exploited in terms of the background she comes with, her vulnerabilities or his vulnerabilities, the power relations between those who are profiting from their work, drug issues, abuse issues. We think there's exploitation, but we don't want to pile on that exploitation by making the sex worker or the prostituted woman a criminal. So we're going to make buying sex a crime, but not selling sex. Okay, you all get that? Okay, buying it. Make the customer the one who's shamed, not the one who's selling. And that's the Scandinavian model. Okay, and these are in competition. You see debate about this all around the world. Okay, but you take all of that, and you still say, according to the law, Tawana is free to disagree. The law is wrong a lot of the time. Okay, she's free to disagree. But the law says trafficking is something different. Wherever you come out on that debate about the sex worker, trafficking is different because it's either involuntary or it's a child. And in those two instances, we're going to put it in a different category. And to the degree that it's criminal, it's a felony. It's not just a misdemeanor. It's not just a vice crime. It's a serious thing. And so there's a complex three-part definition in something called the Palermo Protocol. This is the 2000 UN Convention on Organized Crime, has a specific section on human trafficking that has a very complicated three-part definition. You can look it up, Palermo Protocol, Google it. Like I said, it'll put you to sleep. I'm a law professor, but tonight I don't have to do the technicalities unless you ask me about it. So, but out of that complex three-part definition, the essence is, as to sex trafficking, well, I'll put it this way, prostitution is trafficking if you have a minor under 18 involved and at least somebody is selling them or somebody is exploiting or some third party is involved. Or with an adult, if there's force, coercion, and you go down through a long list of things that theoretically make it involuntary rather than voluntary. Now look what this does for law enforcement. It puts them in a quandary, okay? Because they're out there dealing with a world in which they've had some approaches to prostitution, which is basically to leave it alone as long as it doesn't infringe on nice places, right? I mean, that's what they're going to do. And occasionally go around and bust someplace. And of course, we've got the internet now, and so we don't need to be walking around the streets necessarily to arrange it. We've got all kinds of ways to arrange the buying and selling of sex other than being out on the streets these days. So they're in that world where they're largely leaving it alone. And now they're told there's this serious thing going on called trafficking, and you got to be treating this differently. But how do they tell a trafficking victim apart from a, quote, prostituted woman or sex worker? They don't come there with a sign that says prostituted woman here, sex worker there. You know, how do they actually tell them apart as they come across them? Streets of Birmingham, streets of cities all over the world. How do they actually do that? And it's not easy to do. Not easy to do. Now, Tawana McCarthy, what she's going to tell you is that, you know, nearly every prostitute she's ever met has some history of abuse as a child, you know, sexual abuse, battering, drug problems, and then some person who comes along and grooms them, says that they care about them, brings them into a relationship, and then switches to this power relationship, beats them up, uses their drug addictions, and she's going to say, look, even if they think it's voluntary, it's not really voluntary. But it's not really easy for a police officer to follow that line. And they're looking for something that isn't so like, I've got to go deep into this woman's psyche and figure out, you know, where she is. So it's not so easy to do concretely, just on the sex trafficking side. You all get that? Okay. Now we're going to move along to the, and we'll do this one quickest of all. I'm going to move this out of the way here. To the labor trafficking side. Okay, what labor trafficking is something else that puts the authorities in a dilemma. We've got, as was well known, touching upon the immigration issue, which is one of, as I'm sure everyone here is aware, one of the most controversial issues in American politics. You know, what should we do or not be doing about the 10 to 12 million undocumented aliens in our midst? We've had some laws here in Alabama passed. I don't even want to go there if I don't have to, okay? But what was it, House Bill 56? Some of it's been struck down by the courts, some of it hasn't. I'd love to go on about that, actually. Ask me a question, but that would be getting off topic. So if you ask me about it, I'll give my opinion on that, all that. But the question is, okay, a lot of those people came here to work, right? They came here for economic reasons. Out of those 10 or 12 million voluntary, undocumented aliens and their children as they grow up and they want to go to school and work too and so forth, how many of them are trafficking victims? And how do we tell them apart? Instead of prostitution versus trafficking, you've got undocumented worker versus trafficking victim. And again, the distinction has to do with not only is it a child and child labor issues, but much more on this side has to do with this force, fraud, coercion. So we have this classic MO, or method of operation, where you bring people to the United States and they've paid to be smuggled in, which a lot of people do, but where you continue it and you say, okay, now that we've smuggled you in, we've got your documents, you're going to work for us here, you're going to work, you're not going to get the American minimum wage, you're not going to get the American workers' rights, we're going to run you through the sweatshop. And if you try to run away, we've got your documents, so you're nobody here. And besides which, you're undocumented as to what counts, and so you're not going anywhere anyway. And so that's where the line, again, becomes trafficking. That's the line. If they're, but again, that's hard for the authorities to deal with. Because under federal law, they're supposed to treat an undocumented alien differently than a trafficking victim on the worker or non-sex side. They're supposed to get the possibility of a special visa, special permission to come here to the U.S. They're supposed to be treated as a victim if they go through certain hoops. Same thing with the sex trafficking victim. If they cooperate with the federal authorities and do A, B, and C, and they're foreign, then they're supposed to be given certain breaks. But again, the authorities meet undocumented workers all the time, and so how do they tell them apart? Now, I have to just realized I may have given you a misperception, but you should understand out of that sex trafficking side that, well, you probably have all seen the TV show about the poor Moldovan Russian girl who ended up here in New York City or Atlanta or here in Birmingham and is a forced sex worker, and that does happen. By the definition that we've created in the 2000 Trafficking Victims Protection Act, all underage prostitution here in the U.S. that's homegrown becomes human trafficking. So we've got plenty of homegrown, what the law says is human trafficking in Birmingham, Alabama, Atlanta, Georgia, and all around. We've got plenty of young, homegrown American young women, some young men. Big percentage of our runaways. If you run away as a teen, you're going to get hit on for sex pretty fast. And, there are going to be people who are going to want to profit off of that pretty fast. And you'll be drawn into this world. And so, we may have, tens of thousands of homegrown sex trafficking victims right here because we got a lot of runaways. And we've got a lot of just sort of teens coming from difficult circumstances. And again, it's kind of this false love thing where somebody comes along and they're the older boyfriend and they're really, nifty and cool and loving and you feel special. But then after you're into the relationship a certain ways, honey, I need you to do this for me. And at some point, it goes from love to abuse, but then you're kind of picking on people for whom maybe the line between abuse and love was never that big of a line in terms of their background. Y'all understand what I'm talking about? Okay, so we got plenty of that right here, but again, Tawan may have talked about immunity for juveniles as a law we don't have here in Alabama. Is something she'd like to see. Did you talk about that? Just a bit, but that has to do with one of the controversial issues as to what can the law do. Right now, if we get a juvenile caught up in this dragnet for essentially, sex work, prostitution under our Alabama laws, the question is, they ought to be under our federal law, they ought to be automatically a trafficking victim. But are we treating them as a juvenile delinquent? And are we re-victimizing them? And there's a whole slew of people, including Tawan usually, I hope I'm not misquoting her, who want us to have this safe harbor law that says, okay, if you got a minor caught up in some kind of sex work, you can't treat them as a juvenile delinquent. You can't treat them as a criminal. You all know juvenile delinquency is when a juvenile underage person does a crime and we don't treat them in the adult system, we treat them in the juvenile system. That you got to treat them as a victim. But I've had other people in the movement say to me, the problem with doing that is we don't have any mechanism to hold them, and a lot of these victims, if you don't hold them as a juvenile delinquent, you have no way to supply services and to force them not to go out there again, and this is the only device we have to actually do anything for them. And so other people therefore oppose the safe harbor laws. Now, of course, the best of all worlds would be to have some specialized regiment where we could intervene and not just let them say, well, I'm a victim, guess I get to go back to my boyfriend now, right? Now, because you can't hold me. And so we don't want that result either. Okay. Now I'm going to move on to adoption and surrogacy. And here, it's close to home in another kind of way. I can ask you, anyone here an adopted person? You don't have to if it's, if you don't want to say, you don't have to answer my questions, what I tell all of my students, because I'm very blunt with my questions, okay? Especially in a group setting. But anyone here an adopted person? Anyone here have adopted people in their family? Children, aunts, uncles? Where are they from? How many international? Okay. What countries?
Ukraine.
China, Ukraine, India, India, Romania, okay. And how many domestic? Okay, helpful. Yeah, I mean, I have 2 adoptive daughters from India. We have a big family, a bunch of birth kids too. But I spend a lot of my time on the intercountry adoption issue. This is one of these classical areas where a lot of what I'm about to say is going to sound negative, but understand, I am an adoptive parent. I love my daughters. They're kind of grown up. I got children 10 to 29, so they're really, big spread. I got 8 children, 3 grandchildren, 3 of my kids are married. Okay, so I spend all my time parenting. I don't actually ever go to work. Just spend all my time parenting. But basically, and now grandparenting, but it is easier, yes, especially when I've got great parents so far. So that's when it is easy, when you have great parents and you just kind of enjoy it, right? But I'm still parenting a 10-year-old, So basically, I'm not anti-intercountry adoption, but I have to tell you that there's a tremendous link between trafficking and intercountry adoption, and that's what I'm, quite expert in, for better or for worse. The link starts with really, well, there are a lot of places to start the story. One would be the notion that when I asked you, is the world getting better or worse? When we have new things that we can do that we didn't used to be able to do, it gives opportunities for things to get better and worse at the same time. So obviously, in the contemporary world, we have airplanes, we have modern transportation, we have modern communication. We are quite linked, and that makes it easier to move people across borders in both good ways and bad ways, right? It makes us a more connected world. And with modern communications and modern media, you see this thing and you feel connected to this poor little child you see in an ad or on TV that's in Ukraine, India, China, wherever. Okay, and so, but there's another side, which is there's one riddle we haven't really solved, which is infertility. Age-old thing, and yes, we have our fertility treatments, but we've got about 10% of our population who have serious fertility problems, and so we do have a lot of people who have what I would call a demand side. When you think about slavery, of course, you think about it, people wanted slaves for economic gain. Of course, we set it up here in the U.S. where the slaves would have children, so you have more slaves, right? And where slavery passed through, even if your father was, not to get too controversial, but even if your father was Thomas Jefferson, ex-president of the United States, if your mama was a slave, you were a slave, in terms of Sally Hemings and all that story. And yeah, genetically, maybe it wasn't Thomas, maybe it was his brother, but you all get the picture, okay? So, we had this thing where, we wanted labor. But baby fever is a very powerful thing too. And there's a real suffering with not being able to have children when you want them. And there is. I mean, it's not been my wife and I's problem. So, I maybe I'm not as sympathetic as I should be, but it is a real problem. And so the demand for babies is a worldwide demand that people don't always appreciate. And it's fueling people to do some extraordinary things. Now, when it comes to the world of adoption, what people tend to think of adoption as a very charitable thing to do. But in the kind of supply and demand world we live in with adoption, there's really 2 different kinds of groups of children in the world. The in demand and the not in demand. And this goes by age, race, ability versus disability, and just downright attractiveness. My daughters are very beautiful, my Indian daughters. I have one birth daughter, and she's very pretty too, but that was almost their undoing. That's how they got brought into adoption in a way that wasn't really necessary because, people were drawn to that. So essentially in the U.S., we have 400,000 children in the U.S. foster care in the U.S. foster care system. Those are children who have been removed for abuse or neglect on any one particular day. That's the count, which is down. That's a success. Used to be 500,000, 550, got it down to about 400,000. And we've got basically about 100,000 of those who have been cleared for adoption. And they're generally, the average age of a child in the U.S. foster care system is 9 or 10. So if you want to parent, and are able to, which not everyone who wants to is really equipped, a very traumatized, multiple traumatized 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old and up with, probably some maybe educational issues, some behavioral issues. Could be a great kid underneath it all. I'm not trying to downgrade who they are. They're made in the image of God. We all understand that. But in terms of finding them parents, it is not easy. You all understand that. But give me a cute little white baby, and you can get the bidding up to $150,000 here in the U.S. of A. Okay, so it is really typed out. We send in intercountry adoption several hundred children a year out of the U.S., and they're mostly biracial African American children. You all know that? We send children out of America to Canada, to the Dutch, a few other places, and I'm not sure. I think we could find homes for them here in the U.S., but again, they're very different kinds of groups of children, okay? And some are in high demand and others are just not. And that's the adoption world as it is. Both domestically and internationally, it's the same thing. You can place a healthy baby girl in India very easily now. But as they get on, even with the gender issues, which are extreme in India. But as they have disabilities or get older, the picture changes. So in that context, there's this tremendous baby fever. But you all know intercountry adoption is down by 2/3 over the last 10 years. You all know that? So we hit a peak of 23,000 to the U.S., which was about half of all intercountry adoptions to the world in 2004. In 2013, we were at 7,000. In 2014, forgot to write down the exact number, but it's about 6,500, 6,400, somewhere in that zone. So we're down by 70% or so of intercountry adoptions. What's happened to intercountry adoption? Because in those 10 years, we've had in the evangelical world this tremendous Christian adoption movement, Church of Brook Hills here in town, if anyone knows that church, and this great emphasis on it. And it's gone downhill. And the main thing, there have been several reasons it's gone downhill. And it's different from country to country. And if you want to ask me about the questions, China, sex-selective abortion replaces sex-selective abandonment. There go all those baby girls. It's different from country to country. But we've had this pattern of child trafficking destroying intercountry adoption. This is the other kind of trafficking. Now, there's controversial whether you call it child trafficking. There's big debate. No, it shouldn't be called trafficking according to the U.S. government because the child's not exploited by being bought, sold, and stolen from their parents because they come to a nice adoptive family. My position is when you were stolen from your family and bought and sold, even if you come out in a nice family, you have been exploited. Okay, because that's the legal definition. You have to have been exploited. But the U.S. government says, okay, it's not trafficking, it's sale of children, which is another treaty on. So what's the diff? Well, we're trying to get it into that trafficking movement, and that's hard to do because people don't want to call it trafficking. The U.S. government doesn't. But in terms of law, the primary international law on intercountry adoption is called the Hague Convention on Intercountry Adoption, created by an international organization in The Hague, Netherlands, called the Hague Conference on Private International Law. I am a freebie, unpaid, independent expert for them. That means that, because they need help and I don't charge. So I was on the phone with them this morning. getting ready for a special commission meeting. I mean, there's this famous international organization trying to deal with this treaty that they created in the aftermath, and you know how many lawyers they have working on it? Guess. How many lawyers do you think this law?
500.
1 to 2. Yeah, they have 2, one of whom is partially on surrogacy. And so that's why, they use me as an independent expert. Okay.
Sorry, this is hitting your jacket.
Okay, thank you. So, they're trying to keep up. But the Hague Convention, created from 1988 to 1993, has as one of its stated purposes, Article 1B, to create safeguards to prevent the abduction, the sale, and traffic in children. That's one of the purposes of it. That was true because way back in the late 1980s, Latin America was a big site for international adoption, and there was a lot of, in terms of these linkages, remember I said the world gets a lot better and worse at the same time with these linkages. On the one hand, you think, okay, this is great, we can extend the love of a family to a child anywhere in the world, that's a wonderful thing. But when you create these linkages, you allow middlemen and women to profit from this arrangement. And so what they see is, I get these Americans a cute little baby. I get 5,000 US. Actually, Guatemala, I don't know if anyone here has connections to Guatemalan adoption. It was the hotbed. We adopted about 25,000 children from Guatemala from about 1999 to 2008 till it was shut down because of child trafficking concerns. But you would pay your U.S. agency 15 to 20,000 US dollars that went to a Guatemalan lawyer or notario, as they called them, and they got you the baby. What they did, you weren't supposed to worry about a whole lot. But in a country like that, 15 to 20,000 US dollars, it's a prescription for undoing the thing. Y'all get that? You create an incentive, and that's what happens. The numbers go way up, and then there's scandals, and then there's negative responses, and then somebody gets upset enough to stop it. And then when it stops, the adoption community jumps up and down and says, why are you stopping adoption? It's wonderful. But they weren't jumping up and down to stop the trafficking and to keep down the profiteering and to stop the incentives that made it inevitable that it would all come tumbling down. Now, right now, we're going through that incentivized trafficking, shut down, coming sooner or later, or already here deal in Ethiopia, Uganda, and DRC Congo, adoptions from there. We've already been through it a couple times in terms of Cambodia, shut down 2001, trafficking problems, boom from 98 to 2001. Vietnam, we've been up and down and up and down and up and down. Not talking about the baby lift at the beginning, but later on. India's numbers are very small, but the state where my girls are from, Andhra Pradesh, India, has been closed to inter-country adoption since 2001. They came here in 98. And it's all about what I attached the label to. I did not invent the term, but I actually popularized it. There was actually several other articles that first